Hello everyone, and welcome to the Value Eyes demo for our art class. So our Surrealist inspired Value Eyes are what we are going to start working on this week. So in this video, I'm going to show you our value exercises as well as a demonstration on how to get started with your Value Eyes. So to start, I have my materials here. So on the side here, I have two different types of drawing pencils. And of course, as we mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation, drawing pencils are optional, but here are the different ones that I have in this pack specifically. You can see that there's multiple different thicknesses of that graphite. And here's another brand, of course, and you don't have to buy the same brands as me or buy them at all. I also have another plain mechanical pencil here, and this has 0.7 lead, which is pretty equivalent to a number 2 pencil. So make sure you have an eraser and a pencil sharpener depending on your needs, because since we're shading, you're definitely going to need all that. Here I have my sketchbook page, so at least 8.5 by 11 inches minimum. Up top, I have an example I worked on earlier of what our final product might look like. I also have my computer here and a reference photo to work off of, and then my value exercises worksheet, which is what we're going to start with when we learn our value, our shading techniques, and then pull it all together to start making a 3D form. So I want to mention that if you're using a reference photo, remember it's just a reference. Don't steal other people's work off the internet. Just use it to help guide you as you complete your own original work. So let's get started. We're going to start by demonstrating our value exercises. So we'll start with our value scale at the top. I have the darkest and lightest on our exercises, and I'm going in with a classic number 2 pencil out of my drawing kit. Just to demonstrate for those of you who are using plain number 2 pencils, I'm going to begin on the darkest side, just like we've done with colored pencils and just like gradients we've done with our watercolors. You'll start by pressing really hard with your pencil, and as you gradually get out to the end of your gradient, you'll sort of lift up from that pressure and it'll slowly get into a nice white color. So white will be your lightest, and the very dark will be at the very bottom, and that will look almost black. So I'm going to label mine black and white so that everybody understands, and I'll go over and fill all of those empty spaces. So here I am, just nice and light, getting lighter as I get to the end, filling in those empty spaces that I had before. And once we get into our shading techniques, you'll get a chance to see different ways to shade our gradients, different ways to shade on our worksheets. So hopefully some of this is a review for you. I'm going to blend this out, and again, we'll get into those techniques in just a moment here when we work on the next section of our exercises. So we're going to start here with hatching on our shading techniques portion. So hatching is a very fun shading technique. Then we'll go into cross-hatching, stippling, and blending in this order. So 4 altogether, and there are some other shading techniques as we learned in our PowerPoint in Zoom. So these are just a few I've selected that are some of the more common ones. So I'm going to start with my hatching. So hatching is pretty simple. You're just making those nice lines across the page, and the further spaced apart you get, the more white it'll appear, versus the closer together, the more dark it'll appear. So I'll give another example of this down in the bottom corner. I'm just very quickly and pressing hard, making lots of nice lines. So it looks a lot like I'm going back and forth in the video, but I was actually picking up my pencil and making individual lines. So depending on how hard you press, it also makes a difference in that hatching. So I'm going to go over with some light kind of spaced together lines in there, and I'll show you on the side here again what that hatching would look like. And I'm just going to leave a little note here at the bottom that these are lines across the page. So cross-hatching, with hatching written in the title, obviously we can infer that it's going to deal with those same lines going across the paper. So here I am just doing some moderately spaced apart, pressing a little bit light on my pencil across the page, lines. But what makes cross-hatching a little different is I'm going to turn my paper here and I'm going to cross those lines. So we're going to make those perpendicular lines at about a 90-degree angle across the page, and it's going to make this really nice shading effect. So again, you can vary this with how hard you press with your pencil. You can vary this with how spaced apart your lines are, and I'll show some that are less spaced apart down here, and you'll see that looks a little bit lighter than the one up top. So that is cross-hatching for us. Now we're going to go into stippling. So stippling is a lot like pointillism, just using small dots to create that black to white, to create that nice light and dark. So here, I know my hand's blocking it, I'm doing my dots to make some value in my square. So these dots are spaced apart, which just with hatching, our spaced apart dots make things look a little bit lighter. And then down in the bottom corner, I'm going to make some dots that are a little bit closer together. And you'll see in just a moment how those look a lot darker than the ones that I had spaced apart. So there's those spaced together versus spaced apart, and you can see that nice contrast in lights and darks that just using these small dots creates. So it's a very time-consuming method, but definitely creates great results when you're trying to get those nice shadings into your artwork. So I'm going to go over that just a little bit more with some dots to help provide a great example for us for when we start experimenting with our own shading techniques and creating value in our drawings. So here are all those completed, and now I'm going to turn to the last shading technique I have, and that's called blending. So blending is my personal favorite technique, and for blending it's probably one of the more simpler ones. Just go across the page just as I did with my value scale gradient, make a nice gradient across, and for shading it's okay for there to be some empty spaces, because what's nice with blending is, well, you're gonna blend. So as we learned with our watercolor paints, blending can be lots of fun. I'm going to use my finger to just spread around that color, spread around that grayscale graphite, and fill in the whole square. You can use your finger, or you can use a napkin, you can use a blending stump. So blending stumps are typically sold at craft stores, and it's some like rolled up newspaper, and that really helps with blending if you have one of those, unless you want to just use your finger and get a little bit messy. So blending was what I was doing up with the value scale earlier, so I showed that for just a little bit. I'm going to finish blending that out, and there we have our 4 techniques and our value scale completed. So at this point, we're halfway through our exercises. Now we're going to combine what we just learned to create our own 3D form on the paper. So in this final square, I'm going to start off by just drawing a simple circle in the center of the block. And we're going to make this 2-dimensional circle, so this flat circle, appear 3-dimensional, as though it's popping off of our page. So imagine that the light is coming from where my finger was pointing. So the light is coming in on your left-hand side in the top. I'm going to start by mapping out some of my shadows. So in our PowerPoint presentation, we learned about our cast shadow, our highlight, and our darkest point on our 3D objects when working with lights and darks. So I'm just mapping those into my drawing to start, very light, and I'm going to begin with my darkest section of the sphere. So the sphere is what the circle will be once we make it look a lot more 3-dimensional. So I'm pushing really hard with my pencil and going in dark in where the darkest low light of my circle or sphere would be. And as we learned, the darkest low light areas are the ones where the light is not hitting it, so they're going to have lots of nice dark value in them. And for my sphere, I'm using a blending technique. As I said, this one's my personal favorite, but you're not required to just use blending. If you saw cross-hatching, hatching, or stippling, or maybe another shading technique that you research being something that's more attractive or interesting to you, you can use that also. For my purposes and our demonstration, I'm just going to be working with blending. So, as you can see, I'm just making a nice gradient on my sphere, and I'm going in dark where there would be dark shadows. Now I'm drawing out that cast shadow. So your cast shadow is going to be very dark, but the darkest part of the sphere is going to be, as we learned in our PowerPoint, the darkest part is where that object meets the ground. So you can differentiate your cast shadow from the object itself. So I'm going to go in extra dark there, and then I'm going to finish out that cast shadow, and then I'll blend everything together and do some touch-ups. So the cast shadow is what you would see if this was 3D. It really helps to make the object stand out off the 2D plane. So I'm just going to keep going in and adding in those really nice darks in the corner, and then I'm going to touch up some things at the top near my highlight, and I'm going to end by using my finger to go in and blend out my sphere. So I'm going to soften out those pencil marks by blending, and it looks already as though it might pop off the screen. And now after blending, you can always go back in, since you're spreading around all of that graphite, all of that pigment from the pencil and color, you can go back in and add some more over top of that, and then of course blend that in when you're done as well. So I'm touching all of that up and blending that into the sphere also. So shading is a pretty big process of just adding to your darks and adding to your lights until you get it where you want it to be. So I don't really like the line that's drawn here, so I'm going to try to erase that with my eraser and soften that up a little bit so it looks as though there is light shining on there and there isn't that glaring line in my way. So I'm not sure I liked how that blending turned out, so I am going to go in and just slightly fix that with an eraser and just going over that as well. So you can blend back out your eraser marks, but they're a great way to make highlights on your piece. So now all of this shading exercise is complete and you can turn it in. So we're going to get started now on drawing the outline for our Surrealist Value Eyes. So using my value exercises worksheet as a guide for this project, I'm going to begin with an outline. There's an example that I showed, of course, that I'm using as well to help guide me in my project. So here I am just explaining the size of the sheet, which is again 8.5 by 11, and I'm starting with a simple number 2 pencil to go in for some light outlining of my eye. So I am doing a standard eye shape. So it's going to look something like a very thin football, or just a nice football-like shape. And of course, eyes are all different shapes and sizes. For the purpose of our project, we're doing them pretty zoomed in on our paper. So we're working big. Make sure that you're not having just a small eye in the corner of your paper. Work as big as you possibly can. And with sketching, it really helps to be light, so you can map this out and erase some of the mistakes that you might have. So on the edge of the eye, I'm just going to fix that up. There's a little bit of a divot on the edges of the eye. And then up here at the top, I'm going to add a divot to the left-hand side. So the eyes have little tear ducts on the sides. So I'm going to create those by just mapping out the lines of where they would be. Of course, our eyes aren't perfectly shaped, sort of like a football. They're more of a circle within a socket. So I'm just mapping out where my eyeball itself would be in relation to that. And now the line I'm working on up top is going to be the crease of my eyelid. So the crease of the eyelid tends to be the darkest, or one of the darkest portions of an eye when you're shading and sketching it out. So I'm sketching that out real quick to have as a reference point for when I start shading later in the project. Now I'm going to put in my iris. So we learned that the iris is our center of the eye, typically where the color is. So I'm going to just put a circle right in the center of the eye. And I'm going a little bit darker for the purpose of the video. You'll want to be nice and light and sketchy, but it's okay to go just a little dark, since later when we shade, you'll be able to cover it up with some of our darks and lights in the drawing. So now in the very center of our eye, as we learned, there is what's called the pupil. This is going to be just a small circle in the center of the iris. Again, so I'm going to leave this blank since I'm just sketching right now. I'm not going to be shading that in. I know usually it's just a completely black dot in the center. And for our surrealist portion of our eyes, we know that our iris is going to be filled with some scenery or an object that is important to us. So as an art teacher, I am slowly drawing in a paint palette. So a paint palette is just a small kind of platter plate that you would put your paints onto if you were doing a picture and you wanted a quick and easy way to get to your paints. So I'm going to draw that into my eye, and then once I have all of that drawn, I think I might add in a little something extra just to get the point across of what it is. And once we start shading, or if you wanted to add color to this, remember that just the center of the eye is where I'm allowing you to add color. The rest we're going to be shading in our drawings. So to get my point across, I'm going to add on a little bit of a paintbrush in the paint palette in the center of the eye. So this is what gives my eye sketch its surrealist flair. So in just a moment, we'll see how to shade everything in, and then you'll complete that another day in class. I'm going to map out just where eyelashes would be, and eyelashes are something that you're probably going to want to save for shading later because it looks really good to get some nice darks and lights even with your eyelashes. So this is what you'll have for tonight to turn in, just a sketch. So today we're going to start on shading with our eye. So this will probably be the most technical and one of the longest portions of the project, is just working on perfecting your lights and darks, trying out maybe some of the shading techniques that we learned with our value exercises, and making that eye appear as realistic and three-dimensional as you can. So I'm just using my regular number 2 pencil to start with my shading, and then to get those nice darker colors, I'm going to go in with a thicker pencil, and then for my lighter colors, I'm going to go in with thin pencils. So I'm going to start with my eyelid in the upper eye, of course, as you can see, and I'm making those nice and dark. Here I am switching up that pencil to a little bit of a thicker one, and you'll see how I can get a little bit more graphite into the drawing. So I am, again, for this, since blending is my personal favorite technique, I'm going to be using blending as my value technique for this project. So the first thing I'm doing is outlining the darkest portions of the eye. So of course the top of the eye, the eyelid of the eye, and I'm doing my eye as though there's light coming in from the front of the eye. So I'm going to do the bottom of the eye just a little bit darker now, as you can see. Just going in and lightly shading over it, and of course you'll see me blend all of these colors, all these lights and darks together in just a moment. So you can start however you'd like, wherever you like. I'm using the reference picture that you saw in the materials portion from an earlier part of the video, and that's really helping to guide me in where lights and darks are. Another option as far as references, you could use your own eye as a reference for your drawing. Just use a mirror and maybe shine some light and shut the lights off in a certain way to get those nice values in your own eye. So I'm outlining the tear ducts on the side, which of course aren't going to be just plain white. A lot of times artists make the mistake of making the eye very light, very white in the center. I know that it appears that way in photos and maybe even in person sometimes, but for the most part, eyes aren't completely white in the center. So now here I am blending out my eye and giving it that first wave of value across the page. You'll see how nice and soft all of my values get as I blend them together. So today you're just working on the eye shading. You're going to save that sketch that you did in the iris in the center of the eye for tomorrow's portion. So that way you have plenty of time to shade and perfect the outside of the eye. So now here's one of my favorite parts of shading the eye, and that is filling in those eyelashes. So for eyelashes, I'm just being super light, super sketchy, and making lines across the eyelid, the top of the eye, right between the eyelid crease and the top of the eye. That's where I'm putting my eyelashes, and I'm making them go all sorts of directions, overlapping with each other. Some of them are light and some of them are dark, and that's going to help give them some definition with the eye. So I'm going to finish up these lashes on the top, carrying them across the rest of that eye. And again, you'll notice they're all going in some different directions. Here you get a really good view of how I'm just doing nice sketchy light lines. And looking at a reference photo really helped me for getting the feel of how to do these lashes. So I had a lot of fun creating that nice lash pattern on my eye. I'm going to go over them just a little bit and add some more shorter lashes in there, change up the thickness of my lines and therefore the value of the lines. And that is my top row of lashes. So I'm going to go back in and just clean up some shading around my lashes and blend all of that out. So you'll notice that we also have lashes on the bottom of our eyes. So these are a little bit shorter than the top ones, of course, and a little bit more scarce and spaced together, or spaced apart. So there aren't as many of these lashes as there are up top, so I'm just making some bigger spaces in between them, and they're definitely a lot shorter. And I'm going across in some different widths for my lines, thick and thin, to give them that different tonal variation. And I'm going to touch all of that up and sort of blend that into the eye as well. So now is the time to work on those touch-ups once you've completed your lashes. So I'm going to go in and make the bottom of my eye just a little bit darker to help that pop, and keep blending and blending. So once you get to this stage, you can really focus on your lights and darks, focus on the contrast between the two, and then we'll start the center of the eye today. So the center of the eye is where our surrealist inspiration comes to play. So I'm going to start with the shading for the center of my eye by outlining the inside. So a lot of times on somebody's iris, you'll find that the outline of the iris is a little bit darker than what's going on the inside of the iris. So I'm going to go nice and dark around the iris first to help separate it from the rest of my eye, which I shaded. And as you can see, I am doing a paint palette, which we talked about in our sketching video. A paint palette represents me as an art teacher and as an artist. I've always loved art, so it was something that was meaningful to me, and also obviously dreamlike and not what you would see in a usual eye. So I'm going in and shading in my pupil as dark as possible. So I'm putting a pupil personally in my piece, but you'll see in some of the other examples that we saw that they didn't use pupils. So if the pupil fits somewhere in your piece, you can of course use it. But if you don't have space in your piece for a pupil, I know we saw the cityscape where I don't think there was a pupil, and there's one with a house and a tree where the student didn't use a pupil. So it's optional to add this part, but I thought it went really well with my paint palette idea, so I'm shading that in as the darkest portion of the eye. Now I'm going to add some gradation into the little blotches where there would typically be some paint on a paint palette. This is the area where I'll give the option for you to use color in your piece. So since I'm doing a paint palette, I could have used some different colors, and we've learned a lot about color theory with our landscape assignment. So we know what all those colors are. So if I wanted to, I could go in with some colored pencil and fill in my paint palette. But instead, I'm going to stick to my grayscale, I'm going to stick to my shading, and I'm just going to do each of the blotches of paint a different gradient of gray or white, going from lightest to darkest around the eye. I like the way that looks, I like the way it ties the piece together, so I'm going to finish that up with this blotch right here. And I'm sort of doing a little bit of a cross-hatching technique with this. I'm going across one way and then across to the other way, creating those sort of perpendicular or 90-degree angle lines. And the way that they're spaced together and the way that I'm pressing my pencil down is giving them a darker and richer color. So I'm finishing up that last blotch of paint, and you'll see my lightly sketched paintbrush here. So I'm going to make that stand out by filling that in nice and dark as well. So you can see that shading on these center pieces can take just as long as shading on the outskirts of the eye also. So it's nice that we have time to do these each in individual steps every day so we can get these projects looking nice. So now I'm going to finish up by adding those bristles onto my brush and shading in the rest of the paint palette. I'm going to touch up the areas that I think need touched up, just as I did with the outskirts of the eye last class. So it's already coming along pretty well. I think I'll add a highlight using my eraser. Don't forget that you can add really nice white tones and highlights in your piece by just erasing them off. So I'm going to finish with a flat gradient across the rest of the piece, just to give it some variation. And maybe you want to make your iris have some gradients in it. All up to you. This is the part where you get to get super creative and tap into some of that surrealist information that we learned. So think about what makes you unique. Think about how you can make this dreamlike and fantasy-like. So I'm going to add a little bit around the edges of a gradient, and then I'll finish off the inside of my eye by just blending everything out, and again softening those harsh lines, softening out our gradient, and finishing with a really nice touch-up around the eye. So this is the portion where you can step back and look at a reference and see how your drawing compares to that, to add some finishing touches and get ready to submit your final piece. So I might add just a little bit around it, and then I would take my picture of my original work to submit for homework. So thank you for joining me for our Surrealist Value Eye demonstration. So earlier in the video, we accomplished our value exercise worksheet where we discussed value gradients, shading techniques, and created a 3D form using those techniques. And then we completed our final project, putting all of our new knowledge together and giving it that surrealist flair in the center. So I look forward to seeing all of this tonight. Thank you and good luck.